ahead and start. But I will hand it over to you without further ado. Please go ahead, Ruby, Molly, and Jan.
Ruby, you start.
Okay. So starting, one of the things that I think has been swirling in the wake of the pandemic has been a lot of trying to understand what can we be doing better? What did we learn? What did we need to relearn? What are we committed to not going back to? And in all of that happening, the FEMA rule change is kind of the big umbrella phrase that we're using to organize the idea that for the last 20 years, there's been an advocacy movement in the disaster management preparedness in the arts practice to get FEMA to loosen and reconsider some of the restrictions and some of the entry points for access to the individual assistance program by individuals, and individuals primarily that are self-employed or running small businesses, and that encompasses then are the creative workers that a lot of us either provide direct support or indirect support. And with the executive order that was issued at the beginning of the Biden administration that really called for federal agencies to center equitable practice, that also became a catalyst for some of the immediacy now that we're seeing as we're approaching the elections, of a lot of the agencies now announcing some of the work that's been underway, or some of the work that they've been able to accomplish, or some of the work that they are still yet undertaking. And one of the areas that's been affected by that movement has been the individual assistance program that's available through FEMA for federally declared disasters. And now we're all in the the hurry up ofness that's happening. And to date, there's been I think we were at 11 several federally declared disasters since the rule change went into effect on March 22nd. So we NCAPER and Surf Plus in particular, plus Molly and Amy Schwartzman, who many of you may be familiar with, who does a lot of work in the New York area, have been in contact and in connection with the group at FEMA that both organizes and directly administers or is connected to the direct implementation of the rule changes themselves. So our push has really been to get the conversation going. We recognize that being as close as we are to the process, we have a lot of really deep information, but a lot of y'all, this is probably, or hopefully not probably, because we've been doing some work, hopefully not the first time that you're hearing about it. And so really trying to create some entry points, some considerations, and then how do we as funders think about the future of readiness, readiness, response, relief, recovery, and mitigation, and how do we start to normalize and continue to work at operationalizing support for these types of activities, not just for individual artists, but also for arts organizations. So it's been an incredible partnership collaboration between the Craft Emergency Relief Fund and the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response in trying to get the word out and to be a part of these conversations. So I'm gonna kind of plant that there. For those of you that are not familiar with who I am, my name is Ruby Lopez Harper. I currently hold the position of Executive Director with the Craft Emergency Relief Fund. I'm just over a year and a half in the role, but I've been working in disaster management in the arts for about 15 years, both as a communication hub, a network organizer, and a practitioner myself. And so being able to be a part of this conversation is really exciting now in the role that I'm in as a grant maker and as an organization that is solely focused on supporting craft artists. I'm going to bounce it to Jan to talk a little bit about some of the work that NCAPER has been doing and also share a little bit about who she is. And then Jan, if you would bounce it to Molly, and then we can kind of get to the conversation.
Got it. Thanks, Ruby. And thank you, everybody. It's so wonderful to start a meeting with such fun music. I just got back from Spoleto for like a day and a half, and I saw 3 performances, and I'm still kind of just thrilled about it. But anyway, yes, I'm Jan Newcomb. I'm executive director of the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response, which we, for obvious reasons, called NCAPER. And NCAPER really started, became an entity, a coalition in 2006 after we realized, or the arts sector realized, that after Katrina and Hurricane Rita, that a high majority of the arts sector was not given any kind of assistance in recovering through FEMA money and efforts. And we realized that this is because the definition of cultural resources at that point, they didn't think it included artists and arts organizations. I don't kind of realize that, but that was a huge thing. So for 20 years, we've been advocating for these changes that have really come up in the last, March 22nd. And it's exciting. And it's the type of thing that public response for comments is still open, that period, until July 22nd. So if any of you wants to go on our site and figure out, we have a 5-minute response, a 10-minute response, and a longer one. So you can do it quickly, or you can say how it's important for you and what you do. But my background, I was a dancer, and I've run 10 arts organizations over the years. So my on-the-job training is what I had in dealing with crises and disasters. And really what we're pushing is for funders to become involved with getting arts organizations and artists to really think ahead and prepare and decide, what can I do to help mitigate issues that are going to occur after whatever it is. And it's not just disasters that FEMA responds to. Even the smaller ones can be just as devastating. And also there are all the human-made responses that are really high and rising. So we're really interested in moving the needle, getting everybody. I would love it if every organization just had a culture of preparedness as part of every day, from janitor to whatever, and everybody thinking about it and bringing it up in staff meetings, like, how can we be better at this? And so that's kind of where we are. And Molly does a yeoman's job with us, and I'll let her speak about what she does and has added. Thanks.
Right. Thank you. Thanks, Jan. And thanks again, Jamie, for making this conversation happen today. I'm Molly Quinlan Hayes. I'm the Fund Development and Program Officer at NCAPER. I've been in that role for also about 1.5 years, but for many years prior to that, I was on the NCAPER steering committee. And I want to just give a nod to Stephanie Atkins at NPN, who is on our steering committee and has been a big part of our work over the years, and really trying to, our work is trying to build a national safety net for the arts. And so I Jan and Ruby have hit on a lot of important points, and I know we'll have some time today to get into some of the kind of the granular issues around FEMA, but I would just say before we open the conversation that thank you all for being here today. When Jamie recorded the podcast with us, one of the things that I mentioned when I got started in this, it was very unintentionally. I had joined the staff of South Arts 6 months after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, and just suddenly, was in the midst of the response to the Gulf Coast. And at that time, it was kind of a gathering of the willing. Folks who cared about this got together and said, we need to be better in both practice and policy in protecting the arts and creative sector. But fast forward to 2024, and I don't think it's any longer a choice. So, we all have to be in this somehow. So I'm really interested in what kind of ideas and questions you all have today, and how you're thinking about if this is already a part of your all's work. If not, how can we all brainstorm together about how to make it become a little bit part of our work? As Jan said, if we expect the culture in arts organizations to change, our culture has to model that as well, as service providers, as funders, as partners. So I think I'll just pause there and just see what thoughts, questions y'all have, things you want to talk about today.
Yeah, this is Jamie. Please feel free to come off of mute if you have a question or drop a question in the chat. I also have a couple if no one else has any, but this is the committee's time, so.
Hi, this is Erica Jones Craven speaking, and after listening to the podcast, I was just very, I guess, just taking a lot in, just kind of seeing the role that FEMA played when it comes to disasters, because that's not information that you would know. I'm based here in Atlanta, Georgia, so I remember when specifically Hurricane Katrina happened. I was like in middle or elementary school. And I just remembered a whole bunch of new kids coming in, and there was not really a lot of discussion around why it was happening or the impacts. But now, kind of honing into my career and being associated very closely with the arts, I was wondering, specifically to Molly, you talked about like the aftermath of disasters and how FEMA may not always be the first people to, or the first organization rather, to look to for relief. What can organizations do better to make sure that they're better prepared? And how is FEMA, and what work do you think that FEMA and the organizations that you all work in with NCAPER and Surf Plus provide to smaller organizations? And I know it's a long-winded question, but also I remember when COVID-19 happened, I was about to graduate from my master's program and I went home for spring break and never came back. Oh. And I know that one of our immediate responses was to create a mutual aid fund where, graduates from the program were kind of pouring in and giving insight on how to make these things happen. How can we bring in these larger organizations to help empower smaller entities to, protect the arts and make sure that we are prepared for next steps without a timeline, I guess.
Yeah, those are all great questions, Erica, and several of them. So I'm going to hone in on one and then ask Jan and Ruby to jump in. But I think that this sounds really basic and really obvious, but networking, and I mean, you talked about mutual aid, and I just got back yesterday. I was at the meeting of culture responders, and I think one of the things that we saw in COVID that I think was a healthy change that has stuck is that a lot of us, our walls came down. We had to talk to each other for mutual support, for survival, and a lot of those walls have stayed down. And I think one of the things that we see that's most critical is that in communities, when a disaster happens, whether it is something relatively small, because FEMA doesn't always come in, they only come in when it reaches a certain level, and the state has to ask for FEMA help. So often if it's just a local issue, it never gets up to that level of response. And we see in communities that where there is good networking and collaboration and communication, the response and relief happens more quickly, more equitably, more responsibly. Whereas if it's everyone just acting on their own and the public sector isn't talking to the private sector, and the community foundation isn't talking to the arts people, isn't talking to the social service people, and it's scattered, that's harmful to the community. So, and they lose opportunities. So that's an answer to just a part of your question, but I think this whole idea of networking and being connected with your peers, so that when a disaster happens, you're not suddenly starting to create those relationships, but you're able to pick up the phone and talk to the people who are going to be able to respond is game changing when it comes to this kind of work. I'll toss it to my colleagues. And what else would you like to answer of Erica's question?
I just wanted to say that what I heard was small and medium-sized organizations, which is my love. And quite honestly, especially in rural areas, those are the organizations that make things happen in the community. And if they're not relevant in their communities, they're not going to be around very long. And they get that. And so any kind of support that we have a couple, the Performing Arts Readiness Project has funded individual planning for small organizations as well as networks. And it's interesting to me that they're the ones that really grab onto this, and they say, okay, we need to do this because we have all the artists. You know, if you're a local arts agency, you're probably the one that knows the 300, 400 artists in your community, and you want to make sure that that information about preparedness and any kind of relief that you can get for them is there. And we do response calls after events, devastating events. And so we just had our 17th call with Maui folks, and it's been amazing over the months that we have spoken with them, and to see how, the energy that has come about and how they're working together and making things happen. And the whole idea is you don't want to go back to where it was. You want to create the community that you really have always wanted or have always envisioned. And that's what this kind of work can really help communities do. And at NCAPER, we have a crisis analysis and mitigation, we call it CAM, coach program for arts responders. And we're now also working with the emergency management people in areas, because that kind of network where you're, going with the first responders, know who you are, and who the arts community is in the general community, it really makes mitigation for future events less devastating. And you really do know your community, and it is all about local leadership, really is inclusive leadership. Ruby.
Yeah, thank you. The last thing that I'll add is, to riff on the network relationships and being connected as a funder, as an intermediary. I think it's also important to make sure that you are building those relationships so there's trust, so that when you have resources, people aren't scared to share. What we saw a lot in the beginning of the pandemic was these little individual pockets of money popping up, and it was $250, $50, $100, $500, on the rare occasion, $5,000. And the energy and the time and the re-traumatizing of artists and individuals who were struggling, and the ones that were deeply affected by what was happening, was just happening over and over and over. And certainly we were in a situation as funders where supply was never going to meet demand. And what I lamented in all of that was that everybody wanted to be on their own. And if we had just pooled those resources and thought differently about how we could, as these, kind of more coalition, more collective approach, would it have changed the way that people were accessing or able to access resources? And then also thinking about what can we be building or being aware of ahead of the disaster. So to Molly's point, having these relationships before something happens really improves the process, improves the ability for people to stabilize more quickly. And this is across all of the areas. It isn't just in the arts, that if the arts, instead of a standalone, function, are connected into these bigger response units, like what's happening at city government, what's happening in county government, what's happening at the state level, whether it's federally declared or something that's just, happening in that individual community. for the larger community to understand what the assets are that the arts bring, whether it's healing post event, whether it's distribution and a gathering place, whether it's your own resources, right? I think there's a lot that we forget that we bring to the table, and we often act very insular, but we're actually part of this larger machine that's happening. And to be connected ahead of time is going to improve the ability for everything to bounce back and stabilize more quickly. Also, don't be afraid of utilizing and bringing in intermediaries. I think one of the most incredible things that I've watched is how communities have utilized NCAPER as a neutral gathering point, that NCAPER comes in and they don't have a bias and they don't have a predetermined relationship. Nobody's more valuable than anybody else. It's a really neutral space where people can come together and share and ask. And it's a safe, I want to say safe space because people are feeling really vulnerable in the wake of an event, and the calls that NCAPER is able to organize. And all it takes is a quick email to Jan or Molly and say, hey, this has happened in my community. Would you help us get together? And they can immediately launch those. They can organize them. They can help be a stabilizing point. Intermediaries like us, we have relationships as a national organization with artists across the country. And we also organize with, craft schools and craft museums and anything craft related. So folks like us have existing relationships that we can leverage to be quick about the response. What we like to do is then, after things have stabilized, what can we do to help build capacity in that local community? Who are we leaving behind with information and empowered to be able to continue to be a point of support? Sometimes that's going to be dollars if we have them, and sometimes that's going to be expertise and resources. Sometimes that's just going to be an ongoing, like, yes, we can talk. Yes, we can help send that out. Yes, we can signal boost. Yes, we can connect you to other folks. And it's that, building of the relationship as the event is happening. And we're also in for the long haul, as is NCAPER, that the recovery process doesn't happen, on any specific timeline. If you look at Katrina as just a single case study, they're still in recovery. And it's been, almost 20 years. So, some places bounce back depending on resources, depending on connectivity that existed pre-event, depending on other things that are coming into the community, what's already within the community, how other responding, is coming in, may or may not, fast track or slow down the recovery process. And I think for us, we see applications coming in from individual craft artists, years later. We're still providing support for artists that were affected by Fiona in Puerto Rico. So I think, thinking about not just the sexy part of a disaster when you're thinking about relief and response, but the readiness is so important, and an area where we're really trying to push attention and focus and resources, as is the recovery process. Very few funders list on their website as an eligible project funding opportunity, post-event healing project or post-event, artist response projects. Very few funders list readiness activities as a eligible technical assistance activity or as an eligible capacity building activity. And these are simple things that if we as funders mobilized around, not only could we build more awareness, but we could also strengthen and build more resources for those activities. If I had to put my money somewhere, I would put it in readiness, because any step that any organization or individual takes in the readiness phase of a disaster event is going to improve and speed up. Certainly not mitigate. You can't mitigate it to zero, but it will reduce the effect of the event. It will speed them towards stability more quickly. I don't know what the recovery effect is, because we just haven't gotten to that point of it to be able to say, oh, and it's gonna, shorten the recovery, because that has the most kind of variables at play. It's hard to have correlation or causality in that phase, but it is absolutely true that if we can get readiness activated, it will help in the remaining phases.
And on top of that, remember, with all the migration and immigration in this country, we have pockets of just people who are not aware, have moved into an area. They know nothing about earthquakes. They know nothing about, what do you do in a tornado? And man, we have got to kind of start from zero and assume that people really don't know. And so we do have toolkits, we have things to help people, but one of the best things for our response was when Eddie Torres sends out to you guys, if you're in a region that you've been hit, he sends out, of course, I always get upset because he puts it in the blind copy, but I do hear from people. But so to let you know that, and he'll introduce me, he'll introduce Ruby, and also the Performing Arts project, Readiness Project people, just so we can get started. And it's been really, really helpful that GIA has been doing that. So I wanted to give a shout out for that, because it helps everybody just really understand the impact.
Yeah, thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, Indira in the chat says, I appreciated hearing in the podcast about how, quote, FEMA likes to be told what to do.
I should probably put a caveat on that.
No, I'm the one who said it, because it's true. I went through that in 1972. In Corning during Hurricane Agnes, they came in and we said, okay, well, this is what we want. This is not what, blah, blah, blah. And we did the recovery in Corning based on glass artists coming and living in the city. So it was an interesting.
And I think that's another place where the arts and culture sector can be a leader, because I think of the example of Renee Chatelaine, who's at the Arts Council of Greater Baton Rouge. And I think it was 2016, they had massive flooding. It affected like 98% of the Arts Council service area. And, massive, people displaced from homes, having to leave their community for, long periods of time. And, that is a rich, as Stephanie knows, that's a very rich cultural region with different cultures. And FEMA, what they do is they deploy people into that area who may never have been there before. And so, Renee really served as kind of a cultural liaison, helping to understand whether it's language, whether it's foodways, whether it's the fact that there were faith traditions where men and women who are not married are not allowed to sleep under the same roof. And so working with FEMA to make sure that, shelters were set up in a way that aligned with those faith traditions. So as well as helping to guide the philanthropic response, in Maui, there are FEMA philanthropic advisors, and they're on the ground and they work with the local funding community and the residents and those who are impacted to decide what are the places where culturally recovery needs to happen first. What are the most important areas, artifacts, buildings, communities? So just being even aware of that, so that if a disaster happens in your area, you can be part of that voice and bringing that to FEMA, because they do need that context and that local support, because they're strangers.
I'm curious, and I know we didn't get to this question in our podcast conversation, but what about the disasters that aren't large enough for FEMA to respond to?
They can be the most devastating, and we are really developing some new protocols to try to help organizations and artists in those communities where this happens. And it's if I had my way, I'd have every state protocol on how things go through, how the money goes through to people, but we're not quite there yet. And just knowing who is there and who's a funding leader can be very, very helpful in just helping us with the response calls. usually community foundations get involved very quickly. I've seen that after a number, both Houston even and Maria and such. But it is the smaller ones, you know, like flooding is flooding. I mean, it can be over 2,000 square miles, or it can be 2 miles, and you're feeling the same thing. So we're really working on that and trying to get people ready and prepared. And we say that over and over again, but that's truly the only way out of this hole is to really put some thought, money, and protocols in place so that your entire organization or your business or whatever it is knows what to do. Because when it happens, you're just, well, I won't even use the phrase that my military husband uses, but you're really at a loss sometimes as to what to do. And this way it's like having that little bit of knowledge that can really focus you.
I think this is, oh,
Go ahead, Ruby.
I think this is also one of those opportunities where collaborating is so important. As funders, instead of, again, we've got to be the only one. If everybody either in the area understands that these are the most likely things to happen over the course of a year, how do we want to be present? How do we want to participate? How do we want to support? Because especially climate related disaster events, those don't always get federally declared, but they're going to happen. And we know, based on the science, that these events are going to happen more frequently and with more and growing intensity. So if you have had a history of flooding in your area, think about what that means. Get together, have a pizza, talk about how you're going to either come together or how you're going to collectively respond. Because if you have that one conversation, it's going to be that much faster to the response if something happens, when something happens. It's not an if anymore. I mean, just in the last 3 months, we've seen climate related disaster events happening in places that have never had those events happening there. So it's coming. And even just being aware of what's there and asking your organization, as a funder, are we prepared for a request to come in? How quickly can we turn that around? To what extent can we provide support? Are there other organizations who can provide that support? We work with folks like Global Giving and have worked with Center for Disaster Philanthropy to be at the ready, or to be first in as folks that can provide information. So asking those questions and just being aware of what's in your organization as a funder, what's moving in the community that you're in. If you're a national funder, that's a different conversation. But if you're a local funder, you should know who's going to be at the forefront of a response in the event of a climate related disaster. And also think about what else is happening. During the pandemic, we saw a lot of civil unrest. We've seen a lot of gun violence happening. These are all responses that require thought and require resources. And so what role can you play? Can you fund training? Can you fund awareness campaigns? Can you can you provide funds? Because a lot of times folks just need resources. And understanding your role and understanding your level of commitment and being ready to provide that when it's needed can make a huge difference in the experience for folks.
I just wanted to say a little bit about dynamics and the opportunities and the challenges that presents, because I've been a grant maker, I've been a grant seeker, I'm currently both at once. And I, back to something that Ruby said earlier, when you can start to mention this on your website, put it in your grant guidelines, you have the opportunity to just start talking about this, and just by putting it out there, and it raises awareness. But the flip side of that is that, as I'm sure everyone knows, your potential and current grantees, whether they're artists or arts organizations, can have some anxiety around looking vulnerable to you. But this whole conversation is about being honest that we are all vulnerable, and how are we going to work together to diminish those vulnerabilities and work together. So I think thinking about how you present things to make it safe for people to have this conversation with you, and to recognize that by someone saying, particularly on the readiness side, I'm not ready. I don't have an emergency succession plan. I don't even know how to start one. I don't know what we would do if there was another pandemic, and because I have no, capital reserves. Making sure that you are creating opportunities for those conversations that are going to be productive and healthy, and not, kind of this power dynamic where people are a little bit nervous about saying, these are the places where I need help shoring it up so that I am more resilient. So just another thought.
Did anyone else from the committee have questions? Just lifting up again, Indira in the chat said, and the freedom to provide those resources without having detailed explanation from those who need it after experiencing devastation/trauma. And then Stephanie said, preparedness and readiness support is so important because focus on infrastructure and often a community-wide disaster and emergency could compound an existing crisis for artists and culture bearers. There we go. And I think, Indira, you actually have your hand raised, so please let me hand it off to you.
Indira speaking. Just wanted to say thank you to the three of you for just not only the podcast, but this conversation we're in right now. And something that's coming up for me, while my organization currently doesn't provide this in a space of just thinking about possibilities, it makes me think about, for those organizations that are able to provide like capacity building grants, that maybe there is something embedded within that is about preparedness and readiness. I know usually the capacity building grants can sometimes feel more flexible in terms of the what, because it's all going towards quote unquote capacity building. But I don't know that people are really also thinking about preparedness and readiness as much as they're thinking about the building of their infrastructure, or even the legacy planning, right? That might need to happen depending on the type of organization. And so that's coming to mind for me. Again, not necessarily that I know my organization does not have those opportunities for artists in particularly, or any of our other constituents, but I just wanted to offer that in this space because I know some of my colleagues might be in a position where they do offer that as an opportunity. And so just wondering if this type of work is embedded into that grant, or it's an additional 10K on top of whatever the capacity building is, or however much specific to preparedness and readiness, because I do think there is something about the intention of that people need to feel like, okay, well, I know I have the money specifically for that thing in addition to, whatever it is that I want to be building capacity wise for an organization.
And we can talk to constituents too. That's what we do is in presentations. Like, you think of it just as disasters like in earthquakes or something, but we talk about 9 functional areas of an organization, that each of those has to have thought put in on how you would behave and be better prepared to make sure those functions continue. So it includes legacy, it includes continuity of operations, succession planning. What do you do when your major donor is not a good person and you just find that out? How do you handle that? How crisis communication? So it's stuff that we talk about a lot with organizations, and there's no reason we couldn't talk to funders about that. Be happy to.
Yeah. And the other thing that this is Ruby. So the other thing to think about too is it's a yes and. Normalizing the conversation and listing it as an eligible activity just gets the conversation started. Providing additional resources dedicated to that activity, that's a whole nother level. The one thing that I do want to call forward though, because some folks talk about it, is well, let's require it as part of general operating application, or let's require it as a thing. And I caution folks against that, because what we don't want to have happen is cookie cutter plans or cookie cutter, templates, because it takes away the actual thinking of that work, because this is relatively individualized practice. So what is good for one organization may not necessarily be the same for another organization. Is a lot of crossover, and there's a lot of things that are getting to be a little more standard. But what we would hate to have happen is somebody have a cookie cutter plan, and then something happens to them, and something happens that they didn't think about, or something happens that is beyond the capacity of that plan. People really need to be supported in the practice of this work, and not necessarily in the standardizing of this work in the guidelines or in the requirements of the funding that they can access. First step is just let's normalize this as a conversation.
And I just wanted to add that I think everything that Indira and Jan and Ruby just said is translatable to individual artists as well, and small artist-run organizations. And so much funding for artists is either project-based or merit-based. But SERF does these Get Ready grants for artists to help them get ready for a plan. So to your point, Indira, how do we take that capacity building for artists and resource, not just talk about it, but also resource it in a way that they can come up with, with their own plan. So that's translatable too, but it also needs to be customized to the individual artist. So.
We have just a few minutes remaining. I don't know if there are any last questions, or Jan, Ruby, and Molly, if you had any closing thoughts you wanted to share with the group.
I just wanted to say, in kind of going on what Ruby said, yes, it's not cookie cutter, because we're not promoting plans that go and sit on your shelf for a year, and then oh we have to go over this. It's a constant, and Molly calls it's like a muscle. Readiness is like having a muscle. You have to keep working out and using it. It's such a good way to get buy-in from all staff levels, I'll tell you, because you learn so much from your operations people. I've run orchestras, and I wouldn't normally think of things, and then I get all this information. I think, wow, we really have to work towards being better prepared in that category. So it's really ongoing. It's policies that change. It's debriefings, and you throw things out because they didn't work. And so it's so much better than most of the plans that we do and just kind of put away. So
I was going to say too, for artists in particular, I mean, I've talked kind of big and broad because I've done more work kind of in the infrastructure realm, and then more around arts organizations, and now really thinking about how this affects individual artists. And if you have the resources to start a dedicated readiness funding program, never underestimate what can be accomplished by an artist with $500, $1,000.
Yeah.
They're really resourceful, and some of this is around just individual personal safety. We see a lot of requests come through for personal protective equipment, ventilation, fire safety. Some of it's storage. If they are working in a studio that's in their basement, or in a work area that's in their basement, and their area is prone to flooding, elevating their work, elevating their storage, waterproofing, any of those measures matter, and they're not high dollar. So certainly it's a consideration to make, that you don't have to have, $10,000 per artist. They do a lot with small dollars, and with organizations, even funding them to have a training to organize, as Jan said, getting buy-in across the organization. $5,000 would be helpful. $2,500 would be helpful. Offering, you paying for workshops to come in once a quarter, to make access available on a regular basis, so that we're not just talking about this once every 3 years, because we have this perception that we've got to do, basic info, more intermediate info, advanced info, and then let's start the cycle again. Basic info has to be accessible all the time. And if you're not talking about it, the folks that you work with are not going to be talking about it. So, I'm a big fan of educate and connect yourself. So make sure you follow up with Jan to learn more about how to become a member of NCAPER and how to get connected into that communication tree, and connect with folks like us that are doing the disaster relief work already. And we're happy to share what we've learned, what's working, what's not working, what educational resources we can offer. I mean, there's always a great interest of getting more of this information out into the field and getting more funders activated around it in more thoughtful, mindful, equitable ways.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. I'm going to